Okay, so welcome to part 2 in our indirect painting process. We're using the Zorn palette that is white. We're using yellow ochre, cadmium red light, as well as ivory black. So what I've done as a prep before we sort of get into this here is that I have my panel and image transferred onto my surface. My panel is an ACM aluminum composite material panel that I've primed with an acrylic primer, and I've let that dry. Before I am doing this, I sprayed it with a workable fixative and I let that dry overnight so that now my drawing is going to stay put. And then I have this small amount of ivory black as mixed with cadmium red light and a small amount of Gamisol, that's odorless mineral spirits. And I'm using that as a wash over the entire piece. You can see I'm not using too much Gamisol. I don't want it to be too runny. And so I'm having to do quite a bit of scrubbing. I'm using an older bristle brush for this because it just helps me move the paint around quite a bit better. Particularly on this ACM panel, it can be quite slippery to put a first pass like this down. But I just want to get the whole panel to be slightly darker. It was perfectly white, and now it's just more closer to a mid-tone, not quite in the middle of the value scale. But now I'm going to go ahead and wash in some of the darker areas that I need to be, so this shadow shape. And you can see the paint isn't going on perfectly smooth. It's quite a bit squishy, and that's very normal to have on a smooth panel like this. So I'm doing a bit of feathering to get the paint to sit in the places that I want. And then you'll see here in a moment, I'm going to take a synthetic brush and I will soften a lot of these, because one of the main parts when you're doing a wash-in like this on a panel and for an underpainting is that you don't want to lose your lines. That if you've gone through the trouble of transferring a drawing over onto a panel, you already have you have all of it really, of the underwork structural information done already, and you don't want to lose that because you've been too messy in your underpainting stage. And one of the ways that being messy can really hinder you at this point is that you work so dark in your underpainting that you have lost the ability to see your lines. And so you can see I'm going quite a bit darker all over, or in specific places, like the outside of the cup and the edge of the fabric and the shadow shapes that are being cast from the lip of the cup or the handle. But you'll see when I take my fluffy, clean synthetic brush in a moment, I'm gonna pull away a little bit of that information so that I'll be able to still see my lines. And so that's how dark you would want your underpainting to go, is just dark enough that you can still see your line information so that you're still having an idea. And this is just all meant to be a roadmap for the direction that your painting will go in. But it's not so dark that you don't have the ability to see every single step that you need to take when we go into render, because we're really going to render quite slowly and sort of march along in that process, and having all of our lines already in there will be the exact roadmap that we need. And this layer of value is just meant to aid that and not cover it up or hinder it in any way. So here's my big fluffy brush, and I'm just going to take that and sort of soften everything all over. Again, it's not the neatest process. I have to be kind of specific about the way that I'm putting the brush strokes, because it does move the paint around quite a bit, but that's all right. It doesn't need to be perfect. I just need to, again, like, you can see all of my lines now, and that's the most important thing. So now I'm going to go and wash in a little bit more of some of my darks. I'm going to use a smaller brush so that I can be a little bit more specific in some of these tighter to reach places, like here at the handle of the cup. if you haven't watched my video on how to do a transfer, I have that up as well. So I definitely recommend that you go and watch that so that you can see the first part of this process, and then you'll know exactly where to pick up with the underpainting from there. For what I'm doing now is I'm actually erasing out some of the lights. So I've just dipped my brush in my Gamisol, and then I've wiped that off on a paper towel so that it's not dripping. And that's because the paint is still so wet and there's white underneath everything that I've just put. I'm able to use that brush as a kind of eraser. You'll notice that I'm trying to be very specific and not put my hand anywhere on the painting itself, because the paint will just come right up. And I'm also making sure that every time I sort of move my brush away, I'm cleaning it off, because you are collecting paint each and every time that you go and touch the canvas. But this flat brush works particularly well as an eraser in this moment, because I have a lot of really fine edges and it can make a really nice flat point, which is really helpful. One of the most difficult parts of this piece will be this ellipse, and so I really want to make sure that I get that quite right. And so if I make a mistake, I can get my dry fluffy brush out and correct that edge more clearly. Another note I'll make is that every time I take the fluffy brush off camera, what I'm doing is I'm wiping it on the paper towel as well, just to get off any excess pigment, so that every time I go to brush it again, it still is clean and dry. Because if I'm using it and then it starts to get wet, it will start to pull the pigment rather than soften it, because if it's too wet, it just is going to make a mess. Here I'm using the eraser brush a little bit more for larger tiles that I'm sort of erasing out. And you can see I'm trying to flatten some of the excess paint that's left there. In a moment, I'm going to go in and start to use a paper towel to help me to pull out some of this paint pigment, and that will help me to sort of scrape out my lights again. That can be really useful. And so this whole process is a combination of a wipe out, in which I'm wiping out some of the pigment, and then also wash in which you saw me wash in some of the shadow shapes. So those two types of underpaintings are very common. I happen to do a combination of the two of those because I don't like one specific method. Each and every piece I will do sort of a combination as needed in certain places. So this is just a clean fluffy brush, and I'm using that to try and get some of that excess pigment to sit more flat. I didn't like this sort of buildup that was happening there. Because this cup is quite smooth overall, I really want it to all of the paint to sit nice and smooth, so that I don't have any buildup of particular texture over any of those surfaces that wouldn't fit the surface quality of the item that we're trying to replicate here. So here I'm playing around with capturing with adding in darks and using my eraser brush to pull away, and I'm doing that wash in, wipe out in combination here as needed. So particularly with that shadow that's on the left inside part of the cup versus that outer lining of the edge of the cup and the light that's catching the rim. And so I'm really playing around with my brushes. I'm really making sure to try and keep my clean brushes that I need as erasers separate from the brushes that I'm using pigment on. Otherwise, it can get quite muddy. And then like this eraser brush, I'm making sure, to try and keep it as clean as possible. And so I do have my Gamisol next to me, as well as a paper towel that is helpful in this sort of endeavor. And then you can see it can be quite messy, this initial stage here. But I'm trying to pull light out in the areas of the value study, or in the areas of the study that were lightest. And so I'm trying to use an eraser brush and then my big fluffy brush to try and pull some of that extra pigment out. And then, yes, you can see that I go in with a paper towel itself because that's going to help me pull up some of that extra pigment and just be a little bit more clean sweeping about it. Here you can see I've folded up a paper towel because I really want to make sure that I have control and a smaller surface area that I'm able to make the exact shape I need. So here I'm kind of folding it up even further and just trying to pull out the paint without disrupting too much of the outside environment, particularly that rim. And then I fold it up even further to try and actually get a little bit extra paint just around the edge of the rim and even teeny tiny little corners. For this bottom base, I'm able to like open up the paper towel more liberally and just use it all over, as opposed to being very specific about the shape that it's in. And now I'm going to go back in with paint and darken this bottom corner even just a little bit more, that the shadow there is going to be quite dark, and so I want that to be the darkest bit on the underpainting. Again, you can still see my line. That's like an important distinction. But that is certainly the darkest part of the painting in general, so pushing that a little bit darker makes sense visually for us to have that be overall the place that we can see that dark shadow. And you can see the entire underpainting is a higher keyed version of where the painting is going. Everything is lighter on the underpainting. It's almost as though you've taken your whole piece and just lightened it, and that's really what we're focusing on. But everything is in relation to each other, and that's an important distinction, is that it's not just some of it is overall light and the whole thing is overall light. It's that there are still darks and lights in relation to this particular value scale that we're using on this piece, and they still work in relation to one another. And then that's going to be the thing that helps us in the next part of the painting process, is that everything here is keyed to that same level, and we are creating the same sort of value context as the final piece will have, even if it's on a higher keyed scale. You can see that some of this is quite scrubby, and that is totally okay. It's, again, we're going to just try and aim to get it smooth by the end of the study. But that is part of working on such a panel like this, is having that slippery surface. And this is very much a push and pull process. So I will add some and I'll take some away, and then I'll add some. And then when I've deemed that, you know, it looks quite right, that's when it's finished. But we only have a couple minutes left in this whole video. And so you'll see that I am pretty close to being happy with it. We just need to soften some things and make sure we've emphasized the right areas. I found that if I'm going to wash in with paint at this point in the process, that I don't add any more Gamisol to it, and that I just use the paint directly and thin it out by scrubbing it. And that has to do with the fact that I've already placed Gamisol down, and it may or may not already have dried properly. And so if I use any Gamisol and reintroducing a wash, it generally is just going to pull up too much of the paint underneath. But that if I thin the paint out by scrubbing it, that I can get paint to adhere properly to the panel. And so I make sure to sort of use that method instead of getting a gloopy mess. So we're getting ready to finish up here on this underpainting. And after I finish this, I'm going to let it dry overnight, and then I'll come back tomorrow and we'll be working on the primary pass of this cup right over the top of this. So that will be step 3 in our 4-step process. And here is a look coming up here in a moment on the final underpainting so that you can see everything in a little bit closer detail.